Okay, we're filming today, October 10th, 2013, from the Labor History Research Center in the Estelle and Melvin Gelman Library at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. It's part of our Lessons of the 60s Oral History Project, which honors District of Columbia social justice activists. We'll be hearing from five people who were associates of the late Malcolm Davis, who will discuss his life and his influence on them in a panel discussion. Mal Davis was one of the most influential and inspirational social justice organizers and activists in D.C. in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He died in December 2011 at age 74. And I should state at the outset that his life and his death were an inspiration for this project, this Lessons of the 60s, because Esther Siegel, introduced later, and Michael Tabor, her husband, were at a memorial service for him and came to the horrible realization that various great people, Malcolm and others, were dying off without their life story being put down in a place where future generations and current generation could read about it. So that got us thinking that we wanted to capture the history and the stories of people from that time, both for scholars and for activists to learn from. I'm John Hanrahan. I'm with the Lessons of the 60s Project, and before introducing the panelists, I just wanted to give a few basic things just to set so that's on the record too when people view this film in later years. Malcolm Davis was born in Newport News, Virginia in 1937, the son of a banker father and a mother who was a church volunteer. He majored in mathematics at the College of William and Mary, where he was elected to the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, graduated in 1959. In 63, he and Judy were married, and the following year he received a Doctor of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary. For the next 3 years, he served as an itinerant campus minister in Vermont. He and Judy moved in 1967 to Washington, D.C., where he assumed the position of ecumenical campus chaplain at George Washington University, a position he held until 1984. So it's fitting we're meeting here at the GW campus today to honor his memory. Throughout the 1960s, Mal Davis fought for social justice in the South, organizing civil rights, bus caravans and sit-ins, leading voter registration drives, being confronted by the Ku Klux Klan, and then in D.C. helping organize the Poor People's Campaign and its accompanying Resurrection City in 1968, and helping organize anti-war protests during the Vietnam War. And he and Judy earned that ultimate mark of distinction, landing on President Richard Nixon's notorious secret enemies list. Throughout those activist days, his campus office served as a gathering center for civil rights and anti-war activists, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that from the people on the panel tonight. In his later life, Mal turned his attention to pottery and became renowned for his porcelain and for a colorful Japanese style of porcelain glaze called shino that he developed. So now, I guess I'll start. I'll just ask each of you to give your names, and then we'll come back to the beginning and have you say how and under what circumstances you met Malcolm, what you remember about him, how he influenced you, and then we can just go off whatever direction we want. So if you want to just start, just give your name the first time around, and then the second time, if you want to tell when you were here at the university and what you're doing in later life, that's fine too. So okay. Just by name for now, I guess.
My name is George Virkus.
Tim Frasca.
Richard Lipsitz.
Sally Benbasset.
Lexi Freeman.
Esther Siegel.
Okay, now I guess if you would like to start and tell us how you met Malcolm and
I met Malcolm, and we're still trying to work out the years. I was attending a training session for draft counselors, and it was hosted by Mal and Judy at their apartment in Corcoran Street. And I went there and we started our training session, and there I met Dickie and Sally, and there were 5 or 6 other people. And at the time I was in DC looking for alternative service because I just received my conscientious objector status. And Mal offered me a job running the office at GW. So that became my alternative service, was working for Mal, because my draft board accepted that. And so I got to know Mal and Judy through that.
Your draft board was where were you from?
I was from Illinois initially. My draft board was in Illinois. I was the first CO that they'd ever granted. They were clueless in terms of paperwork or anything else. I wrote 3 pages. They read it and said, "That sounds good."
They never did another one after him.
And then I came to DC and was introduced to Clark Moses, who was working at Selective Service Law Reporter. And he put me in touch with Mal. And that's where it all got started for me.
We can come back to a lot of
Sure.
those stories, but yeah, if you want to just go around.
You know, I was trying to remember when I actually met Mal, and I can't put an actual incident on it. But I know that when I first started to understand or know him was because the Serve office on G Street was like a drop-in center. And I was a freshman in the September of '68, in the midst of all this upheaval. And I was curious about it. Was drawn to all the politically active people, and somehow I ended up there. And I would just sort of pop in because, you know, fresh-faced kid from the cornfields of Ohio. And I was just a place where I would be able to sit around and listen to people and hear all of these rather startling opinions about everything. And Mal would come flying in and out, so that's how I remember him.
Let's see. First time I laid eyes on Mal was in front of that office. And I didn't remember it was called Serve. I don't know what it was called, but I got a leaflet in my dorm. This is fall of '69. I got a leaflet in my dorm talking about the October 15th moratorium to end the war in Vietnam. So I was interested in this stuff. I was interested in stuff before I came to school here, but I really got interested once I was here, because how could you not? I mean, we're here, you know, we're 3 blocks from the White House. So I got this leaflet, and the address was 2131 G Street, so I said, okay, I'm going to go over and see what's going on. And it was still nice weather, because it was like late September, early October. And there was this guy sitting on this, in front of this, on his desk out on the street. And it was Mal, and he was sitting down, so I couldn't tell how big he was or anything like that. And he had this crazy, infectious laugh, and I just sat there and listened for the first time for certain. I'm not sure I shook his hand or I knew who he was then. I doubt I did, but I know I laid eyes on him then. And then that rally, which turned into this enormous demonstration, wasn't as big as the one in November. That was even bigger. We probably actually had exchanged words with him between that first one and the second one. The second one was like 500,000 people. If we had a rally of 500,000, today they get there's a rally of 1,000 people. It's a big news story. There was 500,000 people here. I got hooked. I knew as soon as I walked over that first day that it was much more important to me than courses I was taking, than explaining to my folks what I was doing. I just wanted to hang out there, and I hung out there. I bet most days from then until I left the school, literally for 4 years. And I could say a lot about the place, but to say that it was a normal place for me or for any of us, it wasn't. I mean, it was completely out of the ordinary. It's like, well, what's going on here? People very great. He's flying in and out, and you had to know the guy, but he would literally, he was a big man, but he could fly. I mean, bing, he was gone. Bing, he was back. And he'd say, I'll be right back, and then he left, and nobody knew where he went. And we were running the show, and right, we were running the show, and he was supposed to be the guy running the office, and the phone would ring, and somebody would answer it, and somebody else would go get a sandwich. They'd bring it over, and then we were sharing the food, and undoubtedly people were smoking marijuana in the back, and no, not there probably. Probably he wouldn't let that.
No, that was.
Probably wouldn't have let that.
That wasn't permitted.
Yeah, that's right. He would not. That's right. That's right. But
Everywhere else.
everywhere. But food for certain. It was being shared and all kinds of crazy things. I knew I was hooked.
But remind me, later I'll come back to the question, but I just will have to ask at some point what the GW authorities felt about this operation. But we'll get to
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I don't know if we know the
I
answers to that.
know. I bet she and I know.
Okay.
I'm glad you said that Mal and Judy came in '67 because I started in '65 as a freshman, and I have been racking my brain because I didn't have any connection to Mal when I first became a freshman, and I was doing tutoring at the hospital, state hospital, in DC, and that was my introduction to serve. So I was already going to serve. And I actually became very involved in civil rights and working in a settlement house in Southeast. And so I came to the anti-war stuff a little bit later, but had that connection to serve, and then Mal and Judy, and got involved in the draft counseling. And my image of Mal was that he was there. The in and out image is definitely relevant for me, but that he really wanted us to make choices for ourselves. He was not the kind of person who said, this is what I'm doing, if you want to come join me, this is how to do it. He really, I think in his gut, believed that we all should make those decisions. So I actually started doing abortion counseling when it was still illegal, even though I was living with people who were very involved in the anti-draft, working with people who were in the military and leaving. So I had a slightly different take on it, but that was my introduction.
Yeah, I like the way you said that about Mal letting us make the decisions for ourselves. I had been in Washington and left GW after May Day. I was arrested and did all that stuff, and then I dropped out. I felt a little lost politically, that I needed to move from the anti-war movement into something that spoke more directly about my life, which was the women's movement. And I wasn't sure where to go with that, and so I actually just stuck my thumb out and went across the country and found various interesting places to land. But for a variety of personal circumstances, ended up back in Washington I guess it was December of '71. And I thought, well, I'm sure there's a women's movement here too. And there was this movement that was happening. And I needed to work. And a friend of mine was working at People's Union, which is how I knew it. And she was a feminist, and she was very involved in the women's movement, and that's where I wanted to be. And after she left, I just knew that was where I was going to work. And Mal was absolutely, you do what you need to do to organize this movement in Washington, D.C., and I'll provide the support. And you just work it out, basically. Whatever you think is necessary for the next step in creating a movement here, I'll support you. And so he did. It was incredible. It was great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, first I wanted to say to whoever's going to be watching this that all of us in that era had very strong political and social conscience that drove us. And for many of us, we haven't seen each other in 30 some odd years. And it's very heartening to see that we've retained our values in however we've chosen to manifest them. And so for anybody who thinks that you can't do that, live your values and also grow up and have children and whatnot, it really is possible. So that's the first thing. And I think that I can attribute some of that, that ability to retain that to knowing people like Malcolm and Judy who live that and can support that and show that it can be done. And so I have always admired that in both of them. I came to the Serve office from a very strange, a little different approach than some of you, is that I was encouraged by my father to try to go to Hillel, to be part of Hillel. And I did go there once or maybe twice, and it was pretty boring, and it just didn't resonate with me at all. I come from a very strong Jewish background, but I just couldn't relate to it. And I think what happened with me was that I found out about, I don't know if it was tutoring or just being a presence at St. Elizabeth's. And was that what you did? So I'd never done anything like that before, and so I did that, and not understanding what the serve office was, but that's sort of where this program generated from. So that's how I met Mal for the first time. And the office, I'm seeing it in my head, and what I see, aside from everything that was on the walls, was all the activity that was always happening there. So there were always a lot of people there, always engaged in doing something. And so I think it just was infectious, and it became where you had to be, just like what you said, Dickie. And I'll tell another story later, but I was so drawn, I had to be there also. And I think for the last, 2 years of college, that's where I went all the time.
Serve that was an organization, I mean, ostensibly you would volunteer to do
No.
good things in the community, is that the idea?
No, I think,
Or was the-
I'm not even sure that was a real name. I think that the serve office, so it was, what denomination was that?
United Church of Christ.
Methodist.
So,
But it was,
No.
but it was everything, right?
It was the United Campus.
Ministries, right.
Was it the United Campus
Campus
Christian
Concern-
or?
Christian.
yeah, because it wasn't,
Christian
Hillel was.
ministry.
Yeah, but he
a
was
different
always
street.
differentiate. Was it United Campus Christian Ministry or United Christian Campus Ministry? And he used to say it wasn't a Christian campus, so it was the United Christians Campus Ministry.
Which is kind
And I don't know,
But
whichever.
So
when
some
you
have got the
registered
act-
to be a student, you
Yeah,
had to
that's-
write your religion on the form.
Oh,
And so,
That's
yeah,
right, I remember that.
everybody was then directed somehow or another, they got a mailing list for if you were Jewish or Catholic or whatever, and if you put like Rastafarian, well, that didn't exist then, or Zoroastrian or something, Malcolm got you. Right, no, it's true. And, or you said atheist, which I don't know if anybody cared to do back then, but he got all of that, and also
That's
anybody, probably anyone who was not Catholic but Christian. So that's how we ended up like knowing about it. And I had forgotten, I also did tutoring, but not at St. Elizabeth's. That was one of the first projects that I did, and it was through that office. Now, what SERV stood for, I don't remember.
Mhm.
It did stand.
Right there, so you're constantly,
And this was
Right.
1960, well, I came in 1968. The riots had happened 4 months before. So anyone with like a consciousness about the civil rights movement or what we're doing here in the city, it was a natural thing to say, okay, like, I'll be like a tutor out in Southeast Washington or something. It wasn't particularly, well, it was meaningful and not particularly effective. I mean, the project we clearly saw was kind of limited in its impact, but it was, it was an introduction.
but I think for me, it was very significant to, and again, I came a little earlier, so I was there before all the riots and there when King was killed and the aftermath. It was right before April's school vacation, actually. But for me, the experience of being involved in DC, and I came from New York, so that has something to do with it, but it was very focused on sort of race relations. And it was very much sort of going away from just the civil rights of we shall overcome to Black Power, the Panthers. There was a strong Panther presence in DC. So that was very powerful for me and continues to be very much a lens that is part of the way I live my life. And I think that was happening, and then all the war stuff got really hot and heavy, and so then that became more of a focus. But the racial stuff was a big deal for me.
One of the questions I raised when you were introducing yourselves was about what kind of feedback the school administration, GW administration gave to Mal. Did he ever get into any difficulties?
Yes,
Because-
yes.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Well, there was all kinds of incidents.
There were all
that took
threats
place.
of-
The threats
of
was.
being closed down.
The
Remember that?
school administration was a problem.
Yeah.
His board, he used to get completely bollocksed up
That's for
before he'd
sure.
have to go see them. I mean, it was stay out of his way for a couple of days before he had to go see his board.
Who were the board?
There was
Big-
church types.
Church
That's all I can
types.
say, churchy types.
He had one or
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
who were real allies, but the rest
Yeah,
of
the
them
rest of them were like churchy
Yeah.
types.
But it was
Yeah.
it was a very ecumenical kind of, I
Yeah.
mean, it was a,
Yeah, yeah.
it was not a cohesive group particularly, but I do remember also him turning into, I don't know, it was almost like he was gonna be a supernova or something, because
Yes.
he had to go justify his existence, and not only his existence, but our existence there, because at any given time in that office, there were 4 or 5 different groups functioning out of the same office.
That's right.
People would come and go.
Right.
The mimeograph machine in the back was running 24/7. And he, as Dickie said, he would be in and out, and people were sitting there, and he would look at you and go, do something. And then he would leave and come back, you know. And so it was, there was a lot of high energy in that place. I mean, I remember vividly
But he lost
sitting
the
there.
lease.
Huh?
He lost the lease to the place too, right? They tried to throw him out.
I have a vague recollection now that we're talking about this of once going to the office and there was this buzz that Malcolm was either going to be fired or something was going to be happening, and it was the most frightening, horrifying thought. How could we live without Malcolm?
Right.
Kind of thing. And I don't remember, I mean, obviously it didn't happen, but, I have a feeling that he had a way of doing magic at that in those board meetings. I'm sure that there are plenty of stories about that, but he was always on edge. Just as the more that it accelerated, the kinds of things, we had AWOLs there, we had draft counseling, we had draft dodgers hanging out there, we had all kinds of things like that going on. And so I think that he managed, as long as he could, to hold off the storm. But I remember that it was never, just clean sailing all the time.
Oh, yeah, he
Close.
was always a complete basket case, I would say, before the meetings with the board. And he started asking me to go with him, and I don't know whether he did that with you.
No.
I had the impression that I was to go and kind of pretty talk about what was really going on there, and present a very rational, calm visage there, so that they could, I wasn't in the least bit religious, so I couldn't talk on that level at all, but just talk about these different programs that we were doing. And it all was very organized, and Mal was running a very tight, clean ship, and just sort of present a calm, organized, image of what was going on, which was completely not what was going on at all. It was absolute madness in there, but, and yeah, we did that a lot. I mean, I'm sure he did it with other people too, but that was definitely part of my job description. It was actually the only part of my job description that I didn't have any say-so over. I knew that I had to do that much. Of course, I didn't begrudge it at all.
Was that place all open all the time, or did it close down at night?
No, but it was open early in the morning till late in the afternoon, and in the evenings quite often. Because there were activities that we would do in the afternoons and evenings, and there were planning meetings. I had a key.
I think I had a key. I know I had a key because I used to show up before Mal.
I was going to say that it wasn't just the administration gave him a hard time, it was board. There were right-wing people in town who did not like what we were doing at all. And that's where I found myself involved in stuff. And I can't remember how it happened, but either I was in there or I discovered it, but the window got blown out. And it was a big deal. It was in the paper, it was in the newspaper for the university, and then it was in the Washington Post. And what was the Washington Star? Was it?
Yeah.
It was, they came, I remember the reporters came around, and the police came around, and we never really figured out who it was. I was convinced it was the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, because we were doing a program. Mel had a very open attitude towards people of other nationalities, especially, not especially, but in particular in this time, we were doing a program with the Palestinians. And this was, I don't recall the year, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. But I remember that he gave me, I organized this program. You were probably.
Yeah, you
probably.
and I did.
Yeah, we did, yeah. So we there was a professor on campus, he was a really nice guy, he was an Arabist. His name was Davison, Roderick Davison. He was an open-minded kind of guy. He helped us, and he made a speech, and it It was several famous Arab American activists or Palestinians who came to me. And it was after that, I'm pretty sure and I'm absolutely convinced. And I remember going over to that student union and getting into an enormous fight with the JDL people. I don't remember it turning into fists, but it was damn close to that. So those kinds of things were taking place as well. I mean, it was pretty uptight for a little while there. But Mal was steadfast in this stuff. He was inspiring that way. He didn't waver, and and at least in that program, I think he thought it was the right thing to do, and he was going to go forward and do it. And what an experience! Just speaking personally, for a 20-year-old kid, 21-year-old kid, to say, go ahead and organize all this. I'm sure I know I felt that way, and to be involved in this stuff, and you learn things that you'll never forget. It absolutely impacts on what your decisions that you make going forward in life. And Mal was really good at setting those situations up. Whoever said it before about him letting you make your own decisions. This is an example of that. But you couldn't have done it. You wouldn't have done it if you didn't feel strongly about the thing. So you learn all kinds of lessons, and you actually make an impact on the world. In this case, we ran into some fairly. So the other theory was it was the Nazi Party over in Virginia who did it.
That's right.
And George Lincoln Rockwell had just been assassinated. Remember him?
Yes, sure, yeah.
And he lived in Arlington, and they had their headquarters over there. And I mean, Arlington isn't very far away, especially back then, because it wasn't anywhere near the traffic back and forth over those bridges. It wasn't a small town by any means. It was a big city, but it wasn't much bigger than where I came from Buffalo, and it didn't feel any bigger. And on the weekends, it felt smaller because most people took off. It was just the students and the city dwellers who were back. So anyhow, you got to know these things, and every so often the Nazis would organize some kind of rally downtown. So I'm convinced, even looking back at it, it was JDL, but who knows? Who knows?
But you're reminding me, earlier, there was a group of SDS people who were on campus. And I didn't think that politically I agreed with them, but I didn't think they were the smartest people on the block. And they were staging lockdowns in some of the buildings. And what I remember having conversations with Mal about was, I supported it, I was there, the whole bit. But he had a broader view of what was going on, because some of these people, they really thought this was going to make the revolution, do a lockdown in a GW building and, all.
Actually, you're overthrowing Nixon.
Right.
Yeah. Domino theory.
And Mal, I remember having conversations with him about that, where it was like, it's an important thing to do, it's making a statement, all that stuff, but it's, it is the day-to-day work. It is the sort of coming in and keeping your values and doing the day-to-day work that's going to make the difference. And so when you were talking about the right wing, it was also that contrast.
Mal wasn't crazy about a lot of that activity. He was not crazy about it. And he thought it was, I remember conversations with him at the time, that he thought it wasn't serious in the same way that some of the other work that we were doing. And I think he was right. It was exciting, and you get caught up in it, and police battles with the police, and you get tear gassed and getting arrested and all this other crazy stuff. But in terms of long-lasting impact on people's lives, I think he had an angle on this which was very profound and quite mature, frankly. And I'm glad that I was able to have contacts with him, and I think they had more meaning than if I had just been hanging around with the SDS people, which was an option at that time. You could have hung around with them, you could have become a weather underground, you could have ended up in New York City blowing up buildings. No, really. Some of those people were floating around Washington, D.C. Not some of them, all of them were floating around Washington, D.C. And Mal, and I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but Mal may have had a sense that there's a better way of making social change by being more serious, and in his own way, setting this place up, which was a welcoming place for lots and lots of young people who were lively and had all kinds of ideas in their head. It was his way of maybe cutting against that stuff. I wouldn't doubt it first. In fact, I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. Because I kept friendship with him not in any way near the way it was when I was a college kid, but I moved back to Buffalo, and we were in touch with each other all the time. Not all the time, but consistently through the years. If there was a demonstration down here, I'd come and see him. If when he started doing pottery, when he was coming up to Niagara Falls, where there's this famous art park, he'd come and spend some time with us. And all those years, as you get older, you have more and more mature discussions about these things. And I think he played that role. Whether we, and I obviously didn't understand it at the time, but I think he played that role. Serious fellow, very serious fellow, but welcoming, easy to deal with, fun to deal with. So that's a hell of a combination, by the way, in a person.
He had the ability. I remember when we were organizing the draft center. And as you had mentioned, we were all kids. We were 21, 20, whatever years old. And he had the ability to ask the right questions to get you to think about what you were doing. And one of the questions that he asked at one point was, because we were saying, yeah, this is great, we're gonna counsel these guys, and we're gonna send them all to Canada, and we're gonna, we have all these great ideas. And he said, what happens when you send them to Canada? And everybody started thinking, and they were like, well, I don't know, you send them to Canada. And he said, well, is there a network up there? How do we get in touch with that? Maybe we should look into that. And we did, but what he was able to do was to take a lot of energy that we had and make you think about what you were doing and how you were doing it and where it was going to go. He didn't say, we should get in the car and drive to Canada. He would say to you, well, what do you think is going to happen after you send this poor guy up to Toronto? And it's like, well, I don't know. He's in Toronto. So we got in the car and we drove up there, and Mal got in the car and we pushed the car down the street, and Judy stood there and ripped her hair out and said, there goes my husband. But he performed that function for all of us, I believe, that he took the energy we had, the determination, the drive, because each one of us, and not separately, but there were hundreds of us, were focused in different directions. But he was able to take all of those directions and work with them. And I think as Dickie and Sally and Lexi, everybody has said, just make you start thinking and believing in yourself too. And hey, you can do this.
I don't know if this is exactly off topic, but it's something that I've thought about a lot, which is that our political culture in this country, there was a big gap when we came along, and we're looking for how to respond politically to these things that were taking place around the civil rights movement and then the war and other things along the way. We don't have a left-wing tradition such as exists in Europe or South America, where I have some knowledge and experience. And that made a big difference for when we came on the scene and needed guidance about how to proceed. So that Malcolm, who was like an old guy to us then, because he was like over 30, played a key role that was particularly important because, that other alternative view wasn't really there. And so you had people going off in all kinds of ultra directions. Because, you make a break with the sort of patriotic position that you grow up with, and suddenly you're against the U.S. military's activity somewhere, well, does that make you a communist, Because that was those were the two possibilities back then.
Right.
So then if you're already a marginalized person, why not be, part of the Weather Underground, blow things up, I mean, really, we didn't know really how to put these things together in a coherent way. And so that was why I think a person like Malcolm played a particularly key role to give us some orientation.
I want to pick up on what Dickie was saying about the place, because I think that was my most powerful memories of that time. And in contrast to an SDS movement or a Weather Underground movement, or that kind of had no no place, no home. It was sort of out there. I think what drew me to the serve office and kept me there was that it was an embrace, in the sense that you weren't scattered. Even though you were scattered, you're young and scattered, you had a place to work that through. And I have a memory, you know, and who knows if these memories are real or not or imagined, but after the takeover of the Sino-Soviet Institute, these were the SDS folks who came down from New York and showed the movie of Columbia, the Columbia University riot, whatever it was. And then somebody got up in the audience and said, "Let's take over the Sino-Soviet Institute." And it was my first experience with what it's like to be sheep. And I remember I kept myself on the periphery, but the draw that everyone had into that, who didn't want to be in that building. And once they got into the building and they realized that they were really in trouble, because you know, there was the trial afterwards with Michael Tiger, and all. Actually, it was in the old library when I was working there. They would come up anyway. But there were people who came to the office because they were terrified, because they had been, their names had been written down as part of the people who were part of that. And I have this memory of being in the serve office. There was a couch.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
there was definitely a couch.
There was a couch, right. Malcolm sitting with either one or two people who didn't know, they thought they were going to get kicked out of school and their future was over. And I just have this memory of this calm and approach that Mal had that, of course, I don't know the outcome of what happened with those particular people, but it taught me a very enormous lesson that I didn't know about until years later, about compassion and how to work through other people's fears and pain. And I just remember being an observer of Mal doing that. And I know that it sort of crept in to a little piece of who I, you know, when necessary, that it would come out. And I think for me, those are some of the most powerful pieces of my experience at the serve office with Mal. Is he was almost like he, you know, his approach to life and the way he did things kind of seeped into you, and was like sort of reserved for later, you know, when you understood it better, when you grew up.
Yep.
So I felt that moment was a very special one for me.
Dickie mentioned it, I think something about going to classes or not. Were you all regularly going to classes, sometimes going to classes?
Not a chance.
I went to the ones I liked. I mean,
Did Mal ever say, "You don't seem to ever being in class"? Or anything?
I don't think
he didn't get on our backs about that. I don't remember that.
But
Ask me no questions, I'll tell you.
Yeah, that's right.
But I do have a story about that, because this must have been in I think it was the year I graduated. So there was a big demonstration where all the National Guard were out here.
Oh, man.
And I remember I was taking a final. It was either a final or a midterm in early Aegean and Greek civilization. The reason I remember it is because there were 4 questions, and you know, they were about the beginnings of democracy. And so here I am writing this exam, and there's the National Guard
Yes.
outside.
That's
and
great.
you know, it was electric what was going on. And I remember I answered the first 2 questions, and then I had to leave. I couldn't be there.
Right.
So I walked up to Dr. Andrews, I don't know if you remember Dr. Andrews,
Oh, yeah.
and I said, "Dr. Andrews, we're studying democracy and the beginnings of it, and we're studying history." And I remember I was shaking in my boots, and I said, "History is being made outside, and I feel I have to be there."
Wow.
And I walked out, and I remember I walked through the scene, and I went right to the serve office, of course. And I think I may have said something to Malcolm about how I think I'm going to flunk out of school because of this. And then Dr. Andrews wrote back when I got my test back. He said, "I'm only going to grade you on the first 2.
Yeah, about that.
Wow.
Wow.
And I don't think I would have had that courage had I not been involved and felt support from the serve office.
You know, one of the things that was happening, though, in our classes, is that there was enormous intellectual ferment.
Oh, yeah.
about some of the things that we were studying. I mean,
Yeah.
remember Thelma Levine's
Oh,
philosophy?
Oh,
Every
yes.
one, I took every one of her classes.
We went
Yeah.
there like people were sacked out on the floor, and it was
Yep.
like, when are we gonna get to Hegel and Marx, you
Right.
know?
Tim,
That's
I want
right.
you to know, I have every notebook, I used to write in purple ink, I have every notebook with copious notes from her class.
Okay.
Are you serious?
I still-
That's
But there
All
were-
of them, I know where they are.
There were
Wow.
things happening in our classes that we could definitely relate to. Not all of them, but, you know, that's what the university should be about. I
Yeah.
mean,
Mhm.
you know, when things make sense to you on that level, so. And it was funny, because when I didn't finish, I dropped out for 2 years and came back, so I didn't finish until 74. And that energy had dropped so dramatically in the last couple of years. All the professors were saying, gee, it's like, I miss when the students would come in here and say, let's burn this place down.
Did you see from some of you were here earlier than others at GW, did you see student involvement grow, student activism grow over that period of time? Did it reach a peak at a certain time?
I would say 71.
Yeah, 71, 72.
after Kent,
Yeah.
and,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
Kent was 70.
Yeah,
That
it was
was
the
by
that May Day,
71.
that May Day event in
Yeah.
May of 71 was crazy.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
then the draft lottery came in, so that took a lot of.
I think the last big demonstration I know was Nixon's second inauguration.
Oh, yeah.
There was like 300,000 people here.
Mhm.
We helped organize for that one.
Mhm.
And that was there were eggs getting thrown at them and you know, tomatoes and that kind of stuff. And it was just a massive thing. And then when that ended, I think it was pretty much it. I don't think there was a big anti-war demonstration after that.
Yeah.
No.
Well, then the war wound down.
Yeah.
That's what he
Yeah.
did. He did the
Like
Vietnamization, and he,
Was it
you know,
73?
they were out in
And
75,
Vietnam.
July 1, 75.
75, that's
July 1, 75, they were out. But he did this whole Vietnamization thing,
Right.
if you recall, and the American troops were starting to be pulled out. And I think that did a lot to dampen it down. And these things are historic. I mean, you know, you get the philosophy of what's the question of historical ebbs and flows and in revolutionary radical movements. And I think it reached a peak and it started to recede. You know, you can get into all kinds of what were the geopolitical factors and the role of China, the role of Russia, and all. I just think that it reached a certain point and it started to peter out.
I have a slightly different take on that. And it actually reflects back on my experience with Malcolm at People's Union. I think that the student movement is what you're saying, I think it did kind of ebb and phase out at that point. But other movements that were born at that time, in the way that the anti-war movement was, in a sense, followed in the heels of the civil rights movement and drew on that. I think that other movements were, you know, galvanized at that stage. Certainly the women's movement, the gay and lesbian movement was galvanized. Two movements I was very involved in, and they were just beginning to develop and snowball, really, at that time, in the early 70s, and were very powerful for a long time. I mean, and they too had their ebbs, but I think they've also come back. For me, one of the things that the People's Union office did in the chaos and the craziness and the energy that everybody's talked about here, was it was a place where I felt integrated. Because I did identify, I'm younger than most everybody here, but I had been involved in doing some civil rights work when I was in high school and anti-war movement work, and then did that as well at People's Union, but I was being pulled out in these other directions. And it was almost as though you had to choose that in the early days of the women's movement, you couldn't, if you were working in another movement, you were sort of not you were working with the man, in a way. You weren't working for women. And so there was this pressure, like, don't put your energy into the anti-war movement, put your energy into feminism, put your energy into the women's movement. And that always felt a little wrong to me, because I couldn't say that these other movements were wrong or not deserving of energy. I mean, maybe they wouldn't get my energy in quite the same way that you would have put into
Yeah,
draft
right.
counseling or whatever, but I would never have said that's not part of my gestalt of my politics. And the way that could sort of stay alive for me was in that office, because that's where all these different
Right.
elements were. That's where everybody interacted. That even if we were off doing all these different things, we were there together, and it meant that we still really were a movement, even though we were doing different things, and now created that space where we felt like we were working together for this greater good.
Can you explain the People's Union?
I think she just did.
Well, no, I mean, so it would sort of explain how it developed.
I mean, I never knew serve. It vaguely rings a bell for me, but
This was after.
So you were the transition?
I mean, I just know
Lexi
that
knows.
office,
Well, George.
it had a banner, it was People's Union, and I
I think we
remember-
founded it.
Did we?
I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure of it.
So
yeah.
it's quite possible.
No, there's a pamphlet in there's a pamphlet that you might be able to find it, documentary, that has the program. It's a yellow pamphlet, it has red on the yellow. Mel always knew how to put colors
Yes.
together.
It was very
He had
colorful.
absolutely beautiful handwriting, and it always looked great.
Yes.
And there's a pamphlet, and it's got some principles of unity and things like, oh yeah, what Lexi just laid out was exactly the kind of stuff, and I think, looking at it now, you're right. Mel figured this is a way to keep this thing going, and it was a logical development, given all the things that were going before it. World changes, people get interested in different things, other movements come up. Malcolm was a very sharp operator when it came to this stuff.
So this happened
Very
probably around after 1970?
Yes.
Oh, okay, that's why, okay.
Yes.
But it's
71.
striking to think about, because I think across the country, all these movements were getting much more segmented.
Exactly.
You either have to be with us or against us.
Exactly.
And, because that was certainly, my experience outside of GW at that point. And so it really speaks to how skilled Mel was in terms of allowing that atmosphere to be cohesive rather than more sectarian.
Yeah, he was not a sectarian. The last thing in the world that guy was sectarian.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Right.
He had, in terms of politics, I characterize him, I'm not going to, but because he was iconoclastic in terms of his views on various issues, okay? But he was a very sophisticated political thinker, in my view, and he understood this pretty well, and he figured out a way to keep something going
Exactly.
and keep relevant, and do it in a way that was challenging to what he saw as wrongs in society, and that the young people who were coming through his office saw as wrongs in society. He was good at it. He was an organizer. He was.
Mal, just to throw in this one detail, he also had played sort of a pastor role because he would solve people's problems. And that was not a minor detail.
Right.
He also, in the midst of all this social activity, you could go to him, which I did at one point, because I had left the dorm and moved in with some friends, and I had a big crisis. I had to leave, and didn't have any place to live for the last few weeks of school, so he found me someplace, and that leads to the topic of all of these group houses, which we should get into at some point.
Oh, yeah. One last, the other interviews we've done, it's come up here tonight, and if those of you who are involved could talk a little about May Day 1971, when there were 13,000 people ended up getting arrested over a 2 to 3 day period. We haven't really interviewed anybody that's
Really?
dealt directly with that yet.
We helped organize it.
Oh.
So, yeah, so I remember coming on the GW campus, and the day before, sitting, there was, as I recall, it was a women's group that, I still remember this young woman saying, we're gonna get on the bus, we're gonna grab the keys, and then the bus is gonna be stuck on the bridge.
It went way beyond, there were all kinds of, people were buying clunker cars
Yes.
and driving down Rock Creek Park and turning them over and setting them on fire. Bridges we were assigned, different people were assigned.
Assigned bridges.
Different geographic,
That's 'cause
people from
we
different
divided the country
geographic
up.
regions.
Yeah.
Would take, so I remember I had to go to, not Key Bridge, it was one of those bridges over there, and there's all these guys from New York State, we're all going over there, and we were gonna take over and block we took garbage cans and we threw them in the middle of the street, and all then the cops would jump in, we'd run this way, ended up back at DuPont Circle, and, we all got arrested. they just swept the streets. But so a lot of that activity was organized on the campus. Now, I can't swear that some of it was organized in Mal's office. I kind of think maybe not. But it was organized on the campus, and plenty of us participated. And I wouldn't say that, I don't recall Mal taking a stand on that particular incident one way or the other.
You, when you were arrested, you went to RFK Stadium?
No, I got lucky. I went to the city lockup. I was over
Okay.
here at, they put me in the city, whatever it is, the city
UC.
jail.
Oh.
And I was with a kid he was having an acid trip. And he was singing, I'm getting closer to my home, the Grand Funk Railroad song, over and over again. And for 8 hours, I had to listen to this kid. I finally said to him, up, you know, and everybody, anyhow, we were in that place for about eight and a half, 9 hours. I got out, and I wasn't alone in this. I got out, and the next day I got arrested again. It was back to the same place.
Same place, yeah. You had said you were arrested the same.
Yeah, my contingent was the Roosevelt Bridge, I remember that. I didn't really know exactly where it was, but I figured I never got anywhere near close to it before I was arrested. But I too was arrested a second time, and the second time, it's really interesting. I was telling my students about this the other day, because we were talking about the line between legal and illegal action in the context of civil disobedience. I was arrested the second time on the Capitol steps, and I thought I was doing civil disobedience. I mean, that's what we all were there for, and you know, there were thousands and thousands of us there, and then we were all arrested. I didn't go to the jail. I went to the Coliseum, and it was perfectly god-awful, and I spent 36 hours there. It was freezing. I remember we had bologna sandwiches. We could barely go, we weren't allowed to go to the bathroom. It was really not much fun. But a year or so later, I got this notice in the mail, and I was completely oblivious to legal stuff. I vaguely knew I was supposed to come back and show up in court or something. But this letter from a lawyer came along, and it was an ACLU lawyer, and he said, I think that you were arrested illegally, and we're bringing this big, huge lawsuit. It was a class action lawsuit, and it turns out that most of us were, depending on where we were sitting on the Capitol steps, we were there legally. We'd been invited by Ron Dellums, and I forget who else, you know, had invited us to speak. But if you were sitting sort of on the far side, somehow that was still illegal. So that was one of the most bizarre things. But the upshot was I got a settlement, which seemed like a small fortune at the time, and I paid for law school that way.
Oh, well, we hope that one of the lessons of people watching this is don't think that if you get arrested, you'll end up in law.
That's true. Right. That's right.
What are, just on any topic, just some funny, sad stories about Mal that...
He liked to tease people.
Uh-huh.
He teased me all the time.
Mhm.
So, you know, his storefront was a Christian storefront. Like 40% of the people were hanging out there were all Jewish.
Only 40?
Maybe I don't know. So I said to him, I remember I said to him one day, I said, Mal, you're not Jewish, like that. He says, I know you are. I said, well, you know, it's kind of odd. I don't believe in Christianity. I actually don't even believe in God. And he looked at me and he said, some days I'm not sure I do either.
Well, that was the time of the heyday of the Moonies.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
Oh, right.
And they would come around
Oh, my God.
proselytizing, and Malcolm had a wonderful story about that, because he said, I know how to get rid of the Moonies. He says, because they stopped him and said, can we talk about, you know, Sun Myung Moon or something? He said, yes, I'll be happy to talk to you, but I have to tell you 3 things. One, I'm an ordained minister of the United Christian Church. 2, I'm a Marxist, and 3, I don't believe in God. They said, thank you.
That's actually amazing because one of the memories that I have is also close to the serve office where the Moonies, they had a flyer to come to something that sounded really interesting. And a friend and I went, and you signed in. I never would have dawned on me what this was about, because there was nothing Mooney about it. You know, it just sounded like an interesting thing. And we were really harassed afterwards. You know.
Or know that there were any informants that were...
Oh,
gosh.
yeah, that was
Oh, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Near-
I haven't thought
Yeah.
about that in a long time.
I never had any direct contact with one, but I remember it made us all paranoid as hell because we were always thinking that, every kind of meeting we were sitting in. I remember
It's
one
always
time being in a meeting about something or other, and there was a guy there with this apparatus in his hand, and I was about to denounce him as a cop because it looked like a hidden camera or something, and then John Barnum told me, no, it's a tire gauge.
Microphone cleverly.
So I'm
designed
glad I
for
didn't make a
tire
big
gauge.
scene over it, that would have been embarrassing.
But related to, what Tim was saying in terms of Mal solving problems, several of us lived in a house together, and there was a lot of activity in that house. And at one point, I needed a break from it, and I actually moved upstairs to Judy and Mal's third floor apartment for a year. And we would have dinner together, the three of us would have dinner together once a week. And Mal and Judy knew all the characters, and there were, like what day is today, that's who was sleeping with who, and, it was like, those were the times.
Good old days.
And I was coming out of a, terrible relationship. I was not a very happy person at that point. And I remember where he never, Judy too, Judy deserves credit for this as well, but Mal and Judy, they never badmouthed anybody.
Right.
They would listen, they would ask clarifying questions maybe, but there was not like, it wasn't even you're better off without them. It was just like, okay, and what are we gonna do tomorrow? And in hindsight, that was a really wonderful learning experience for me. And I really feel like that was a great year for me to, because part of this whole thing is that during this period of time, yes, we were individuals, and yes, we were going through whatever we were going through and making decisions for ourselves, but we felt like we were part of something.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of being an individual outside of this group, whatever group, that was, I can't even speak the words. It was like, that network was like my alter self.
Huh.
In a very different way than your family, for example. It was family, but it was like, these are your people.
Mhm.
And so it was very hard for me to like leave that and then, move out. But at the same time, I didn't feel like I was leaving my life. I felt like I was taking a step. And it was a very powerful experience for me. And I think Mal and Judy were very good at allowing that to happen without, they just never badmouthed anybody.
Do you want to start the discussion of how the house came to be?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the segue. I guess for me, the context is that we were questioning everything. Everything was in doubt, and we were reinventing everything. And we still are, I would say. I think our generation is going to reinvent old age. We're not there yet, but it's coming. So I moved out, it would be 1970 in the spring semester, and then in the fall semester is when I was hitchhiking back to DC without any place to live and got picked up by the real estate agent's son, who had this house that had just been abandoned by the people who were doing that newspaper, the underground newspaper that was a successor to Quicksilver. And it was called Voice from the Mother Country. Remember? It had like 2 issues.
Yeah.
They were like sort of an ultra-left faction, and they were going to put together this newspaper. So anyway, the whole place fell apart, and they left, and the place was a wreck, as you recall. When we moved in, they had spray painted the walls, and there was like a cockroach colony in the refrigerator. It was gross. But that's when we got the house. And
Where was the house located?
1405
1405,
21st
21st Street,
Just
21st
past
and
it.
O, around
on the way
DuPont
down.
Circle. which was kind of, no man's land in a
Yeah,
way back
yeah.
then. I remember people saying, don't cross the circle by yourself after dark, walking, always go in a group. So that was quite a life experience, I think, for all of us, because, as, we were suddenly learning how to cook and things like that, trying to share all of these household chores that we didn't necessarily know how to do, and then negotiating around them. But it was possible because, someone pointed out, the rent was $225 a month, total, divided by the 11 of us who lived there. So it was like 1875. And so that was, it was possible, and I think, looking back, we had perhaps naive expectations of permanence, and like how this was really going to be a family that would last, and as opposed to what it was, which was, a point, a time in which we shared certain things, and then different people went their own different directions. But it was certainly a continuation of the serve office on G Street in a lot of ways. I mean, there was a lot of movement in and out. There was politics happening. There was, all of this other stuff happening, and people were, forming pairs and splitting up, and so there was all that kind of drama, and trying to figure out how to, have breakfast with people that you were no longer in love with. Anyway.
How many of you here were in that?
Yeah, four of us.
Four out of
Wow.
six.
Yeah, and then, we were
Well,
in different
I lived
houses.
around
You
the corner.
lived there.
Yeah, that was
You
there.
were
We did different
Right around
houses
the
along the
corner.
way.
Mhm.
And, but, it was a continuation of that very fertile period, and we were doing things, we were in touch with each other's work, plus there were people living with us who were doing the draft and military
Oh, yeah.
counseling, so all these
Yeah.
military guys would show up on the weekend,
Oh,
'cause
yeah.
they would come from the bases to be counseled, and then it would be too late for them to go back to the base, and they'd end up with us. So we met all these active duty GIs, and some of them who had, what we would call today PTSD from their
Right.
Vietnam
Yeah.
experiences,
Yeah.
and
Right.
they were trying to get their lives back together, and they thought it was a fun place too,
And we were also trying, all the sort of sex role stuff,
Yeah.
cooking and cleaning, and that was a big deal, being responsible for how many people are gonna be there for dinner, and I think it's okay to say, there certainly was a lot of drugs, but people were also political, so it wasn't an end in itself. I mean, there were some people who were more involved than others, but it was sort of the Saturday night hangout, and sometimes there would be like 15, 18 people who were hanging around.
And also, I think we should be precise about what drugs we were consuming, because there were certain drugs, and that definitely gave it a character. It was basically pot
Yeah.
and acid,
Mhm.
and that was basically it, which, it wasn't coke,
Right.
and it wasn't crack, and it
No,
wasn't
Right,
heroin.
no,
right,
no.
or
You
metal,
know,
yeah.
None
I
of
mean,
Mhm.
maybe people went off and did those things later, but that's what we were, those were like political drugs.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Who were some of the other people who lived there besides?
Oh,
Miss Ryan?
When we started out, there was Sally,
Right.
and there was Prispo.
There was a woman, Prispo, who, she and I had actually lived in another house previously. So,
And then there was Tim,
There
and
was-
there was myself, and there was Esther.
There was Roger and Inga, who were
And Roger
a
and Inga
couple,
initially, that's
but they didn't last long. They weren't
Mhm.
they were really more like a unit, and they later got married and are still together today.
and Sandy Lee.
And
Sandy Lee.
Sandra H. Lee, and,
Well,
and,
Bill Lewis was there for
Bill Lewis,
quite a
who was
while.
one of
Wasn't
the-
he one of the military?
Yeah,
He
guys?
was,
he had-
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
came as
Yeah.
a second lieutenant the first
And then
time.
Danny.
Danny came in as, he
A
was
little
from the Air
later.
Force,
He
and
was
he came
later.
in later with Bill.
Yeah.
a little- yeah,
And
about
when
the
did
same time.
PT come and PT?
PT
John Barnum
came
was
in
a-
about the same
He
time.
was also
one of the
yeah,
And
counselors.
Katie Bell,
Katie
she
Bell,
came in.
right.
And then, trying to think of who else was there.
Dennis. was there.
Bonnie Scheidman.
Dennis was there, yeah.
Bonnie.
Gail.
And Gail.
Well, Bonnie and Gail, did Bonnie and Gail
No,
actually live
Gail
there?
lived there.
Bonnie
Gail
did
lived
too.
for a while, and
Yeah.
then,
Yeah, because Bonnie and Gail had their apartment around the
Right.
corner.
right.
And
Gail did live there for a while.
yes, she did for a while. And I'm trying to think of who else we had.
Did you keep in touch with Mal pretty closely
They
during this
did, most
period?
people did, but
Mal would come
individually.
That
around.
period, absolutely.
Yeah.
He would
yes.
come around because, you know, it was, plus he had the famous birthday cake.
Right, but he had, yes, he would come by but we were in contact with him all the time, and we went to Mal and Judy's
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, it was kind of a, you know, on a Saturday night or something, we might wander up there and, you know,
You
sit
were
down
living
for an hour.
In
There-
Adams Morgan.
That's one.
Yes, at the time,
Yeah.
where they lived for,
19th Street, they were on 19th
Corporate
Street.
Street and DuPont Circle.
yeah, but Corcoran was,
No,
when
that
did you
was-
move
You
in
left
in
pretty soon.
19? When did you move?
19th Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
69,
You-
right.
You
Yes,
were up in
yes,
19th Street by
it was
then.
up to 19th Street.
You know, to give an example of how, what the atmosphere was like in the house, I don't have a strong recollection of the drug part at all. I know I didn't do that stuff, but I didn't feel that it was something that defined in any way the house. But I have a strong recollection of at least two of us, not me, but Pris went, and I don't know if you went, but at least two other people went to one of those programs where it was the prison guard experiment, where people who consider themselves pacifists, and they went to this program, and some of them were the guards and some of them were the prisoners. You don't remember this? This is one of my
Ringing a bell.
strongest memories of who are the amazing people who were in that house. And they came back shaking and telling, it's an experiment that's been done all around
Yeah,
the country,
right.
you know, but it was the first time I had ever heard of it. But I remember sitting around the table and them describing how feelings and you know, behaviors that they never imagined were in them, came out in them, and what it was like to be one guard with 10 prisoners. And I've always remembered, and that's always been something that's been one of my powerful recollections of what our house was like. Because, you know, for people to do something like that, you know, to give themselves to an experiment like that was sort of hard for me to believe in the first place. But then what they learned from it and what they taught us from it was that was a good reason to be in that kind of an environment, because of what you all gave, we all gave to each other, but what I got from it, from everybody else.
I remember cooking, I
Oh,
remember
yeah.
you cooking, and I remember eggs vividly. Mountains of eggs.
Eggplant was big too.
And I remember the food co-op, we did the food
Yes.
co-op, and I
The purchasing.
remember, driving to Pennsylvania to get apples for the food co-op, and I also remember Peace Street Beach, and that was a huge
Oh,
part,
yes,
huge
yes,
part of
yes.
1405.
Yeah.
We were down there on the weekends.
You know,
Yeah.
this is this isn't a Malcolm story, but it's a silly story. I remember, you know, how we had to learn how to live together, and I didn't eat bacon, but other people did. And what people did was they keep the bacon, you know, the fat, right? And I remember once Mad Dog came in the window.
That's
that
your
was,
cat, you
Yeah.
should
That was our
mention.
cat, right? Who came, and it was your fault that you got the name, by the way.
Your fault.
Yes,
It's coming
yeah.
out now.
But it was the best name, it was the best name, coming through the window, and he fell right into it. And he was so embarrassed that he ran up to the room, and he stayed under my bed for like a week, and it was like full of, you know, grease. And I learned, you have to learn to live with other people and you know, do that.
Did you have to take a ritual bath?
The kosher
Right.
cat got
Kosher cat.
the tray full of it.
The reason he got the name, I know this is off the subject, but it's one of my fond memories of you, is he was such a cute little cat and kitten, remember? And when people were at the house, you would say, oh, be careful, there's this mad dog in the house. And then when I went to the vet for the first time, they said, what's the name? And I didn't have a name at the time, and I remembered you saying that, and so I went, Mad Dog? And that's how he got his name.
Well, speaking of drugs, my parents visited. They were the only parents that came in my recollection.
My mother came.
She did?
9
Yes,
o'clock
your
in the
mother did
morning
come,
on
yes.
Sunday morning.
No,
Yes.
but they stayed overnight.
Oh, right,
A
she did
couple of
stay
nights.
overnight, right.
And Rafe, Danny's
Huh?
cousin, had made tea out of marijuana stems. and stuck it in the refrigerator. And it was
Oh,
summertime. My mother came down in her bathrobe and said, "Oh, a nice cup of tea would be just right." Iced tea, right? She drank a big glass of it, slept like 12 hours.
Oh, my God.
That's funny.
Did
I
she
never
ever
told her
find
either.
that? Oh,
You never told her? That's great.
Well, my mother came down, my mother was an immigrant, and food was her thing. So she, this is related to the drugs, because she called me on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock that she was at Logan Airport, and she was coming to visit. And, I mean, not Logan, she was at National. And I went running around trying to clean up,
Yeah,
and I think
yeah.
George woke up. There were a couple of people who woke up, and there were enough people who were like sitting at the kitchen table, kind of looking halfway normal, when my mother walks in with a suitcase of food for us. So she did that a couple of times, actually.
Tim alluded to the birthday cake, and that was a joint venture in the house. It was Malcolm's 33rd birthday. And he had said for a couple of years that Christ died when he was 33, so Malcolm was very, very afraid that the end was coming. So for his 33rd birthday, we baked him a cake that was on a piece of plywood. It was 34 individual cakes that we baked. And we put it in the back of the car and took it over to the house. And I think Judy still has a picture of it. It was a lot of fun, but that was we were making icing and cakes for a couple of days. I think. It was a lot of fun.
Did we eat it? Must have.
Must have, yeah. I
Yeah.
think you froze some of it, didn't you? I think.
He took it home and gave it to the trick-or-treaters.
You didn't need packaged candy at the
Just
time.
little baggies.
I actually didn't ask people when some of it came out as to what you each are doing today, and if you feel that was in some way influenced by
I was just thinking
those
about that.
days.
Yes.
Well, you know, I left the house and I lived by myself for a year or so. And trying to piece it all together now, what happened next, in what order, but I ended up working at the a community radio station, which was at one point affiliated with Georgetown, was physically in Georgetown. I just was listening to it and I thought they were doing an interesting job, and I went over to volunteer. And it was summertime, and so they all went on vacation, and I was like, myself and another brand new volunteer were in charge of the evening newscast for 2 weeks. It was just crazy. But so I learned how to do radio, and then I got involved through that group with Latino exiles and people who from different countries, because this is like in the period when the military's dictatorships were springing up all over the continent. And that led from, then Georgetown then closed down the station, threw us out because we were like celebrating the end of the Vietnam War. And Spiro Agnew denounced us in the pages of the New York Times.
He was
so-
a listener.
Huh? He was listening, obviously. So then Pacifica opened up a station.
Oh, yeah.
In
Yeah.
'77, I ended up working there
right.
and got involved with that. And then through that, it was, that led to the Washington News Bureau of the Pacifica system, which was 5 different stations around the country. And through that, I met the director, the news director from the Los Angeles station, who had been a translator in the office of Salvador Allende, and had to leave after the coup in the first UN plane for foreign exiles who could get on, which wasn't everybody. But he was married to a Chilean, and then in '83, he said, there was the movement to restore democracy was starting to bubble up there, and he said, let's go see what's happening in Santiago. And so I had been working for Pacifica for about 4 years at the time, I think. Yeah, 79. And so we went for a 3-week reporting trip, and I stayed 21 years.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
And I reported from there for NPR for a long time,
Oh, yeah.
and then in the late 80s, got involved with HIV because people were getting sick, and I was traveling back and forth, and I said, I think this is going to be a problem here, although it was delayed because it came later. But I got involved with that, and I was the director of the first prevention organization in Chile, and I spoke on television about HIV for the first time because nobody else would dare, because talking about AIDS on television meant you were gay. No one wanted to do that, so I did. And then ended up coming back to the U.S. in 2004 to do a master's in public health, which is what I'm doing now. So it's all connected.
Amazing. It is, it
Absolutely.
is, absolutely.
Mine's connected, absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced that those experiences led logically to start over. I was born old. Okay, I knew I wanted to get involved in politics, and I knew that, as I said earlier, that was the right place at the right time for me.
Mhm.
I think Malcolm encouraged it, did various things to promote it, never tried to direct it, and I found my way to the labor movement through, at least through Mal partially, because he introduced me to people named McShirley and a woman named Margaret McShirley. And the first work, yeah, she's great, and her husband Al, and I was very friendly with both of them. And the first organizing campaign I ever participated in was on GW Hospital, right over here, with Margaret. And then I went back to Buffalo, and I ended up winning elections and becoming a labor leader in town, and ended up working for this organization right here that we're sitting in the room, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
Wow.
And I'm president of the Labor Federation for all of Western New York, which is the 6th largest in the country. And I think about Malcolm all the time. There are other people who had strong influence on my career, but he was certainly one of them. In fact, I wouldn't say the key one, but he's certainly one of very important people. And so I'm with Tim.
Mhm.
It helped mold who you are at that particular time in your life, and that has impact way beyond that particular time.
Mhm. See this.
I definitely feel that a lot of who I have become was shaped at the Serve office and with Mal. But after I left the house, I lived by myself in Glover Park. And I lived there for 15 years. And the story of how I got involved in housing was actually through the eviction notice. And I don't want to go into all of that, but what I wanted to say that connects me to Mal forever is, so I kind of separated myself, and I did not have strong contact with them, although the year that you lived there, I think I did come over occasionally, but then I kind of let all that behind. And then I fall in love with my husband, who is a very good friend of Mal and Judy's. And so we reconnected through that connection and had been close with them ever since. So I don't think it's possible to really, separate completely from Mal and Judy.
For me, after we were doing the draft counseling, and especially after the draft became so prevalent in people's lives, I started doing abortion counseling. I felt like I had to do something that was a woman's thing, that was more related to my life. And so I did that when it was still illegal, and we were sending people to Puerto Rico, and there was one doctor in Washington who was doing abortions at the time. And through that, I got involved with Off Our Backs and the whole beginning of the Women's Health Collective, and that was my introduction to the women's movement. And then also I had a job actually out of the university where I was a field placement supervisor, and some students were working, this is after I graduated obviously, and there were some students who were working at a parent cooperative daycare center. And I thought that was like really cool, and it was part of this gender, you know, men getting more involved in childcare and all of this. And a couple of years later, I moved to Cambridge and started a parent cooperative daycare center that still exists, that I'm very proud of. And I've done a lot of work around, I'm a teacher, and do a lot of work around multicultural education, anti-racism, particularly for families of color, and having, working with parents to have them feel empowered to work with the school systems and all of that kind of thing. And so I feel, you know, not on a radical level, but all those values are definitely part of who I am. And I'm thinking about it now in a way I never have. I have 2 children, they're both adults. They never had that excitement in college. They never had that experience of discovering themselves in the context of a movement. And it hasn't hit me as strongly as it's hitting me right now. You know, how fortunate I was to have that experience, and how they didn't. And it's no one's fault, it's a sign of the times, but it's a very powerful feeling to me right now.
For some future viewers, just explain briefly what Off Our Backs was.
Off Our Backs was a women's newspaper,
Right.
and it was one of the first,
Yeah.
if not the first.
Yeah.
And it was run as a collective, and focused not just on health, on gender relationships, on child rearing, on employment. It was a wonderful group of people.
Norma. Norma's. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know how I could draw a straight line between moments in my past to where I am now, but I was thinking about one very interesting connection, and that is that I didn't really know Judy back when I knew Mal. I mean, I knew Mal, and I was working with Mal, and I mean, I'm sure I met you, but you weren't, you know, I didn't have the Mal-Judy relationship that a lot of you talked about. And yet, I don't know when, mid-70s, I suppose, I had, with another group, with a larger group of women, and we represented actually an attempt to kind of bridge many of the very serious splits that had taken place in the city over radical lesbianism, radical feminism, lesbian separatism. I mean, just people had spun off in a million different directions. And I was part of a group of people who wanted to start conversations about looking at the interests that we had in common. And that led to the formation of a group that published a feminist theory journal, Quest of Feminist Quarterly, and that we published, I don't remember how many years, 7, 10 years or something like that. And as I was doing that, I got to know Judy. It, totally separate from Mal. I mean, I don't even remember at what point I made the connection that you were, you know, Mal's wife and that he was your husband, but because you were involved in several of the issues that we published in Quest. So.
I worked for the Institute for Policy Studies.
And then yes, and I was working at IPS. Quest was at IPS.
Quest was there.
And Judy worked there. And then, of course, the split with IPS and PRC. What was it called?
Well, we called it the Public Resource Center.
Right.
Was it the Public Resource Center?
People underground said it was
Right.
the people's.
Right.
And we were part of the split. We were on the same side of that split. Another moment of, you know, in retrospect, insanity of splits that we would have in those days, but anyway.
I've been sitting here thinking while everybody else is talking about all of it. When I got involved with Mal and with Judy and with 1405, and I was working in the office, I was running the Draft Counseling Center at the time, which I was thrilled with. I thought it was a great calling, and it grew and it grew, and I got into training people to be draft counselors, and it kind of ballooned and blossomed. And one day I remember sitting down and saying, you know, what am I doing and why am I here? Which I'm sure was involved with Malcolm, because he used to ask me that all the time. He would walk in the door first thing in the morning, and I'd be sitting on the couch, and he'd go, what are you doing? And I'd go, and he'd go, you're fired. and walk back into his office and close the door. And he'd come out like 5 minutes later, and I was still sitting there, and he'd say, "What are you doing?" You know, and I'd say, "Well, you fired me." He said, "Will you do some work? Start working." Anyway, he is responsible for a lot of, I think, making me think. But anyway, I sat down one day and I said, I'm counseling people to avoid the draft, which is wonderful, but who am I counseling? I'm sitting at George Washington University. Everybody who walks in the door has paid, their parents have paid $15,000, $20,000, whatever dollars. Are these the people that I really want to concentrate on? This is what I want to do, is to get these people to not be drafted. This isn't, there's something wrong with this picture. There's nothing wrong with my thoughts on the issue, because I thought the draft was a question that, you know, but how I was doing what I was doing with it, I did question. And at that point I said, I'm done, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I kind of shut myself off in terms of politics at that point, and I just sort of walked away. And I think 1405 was breaking up at that point. It was all kind of, everything was going. And I moved away a little bit, got married, had a family, and then that broke down. And at some point through there, Malcolm kept tapping on my shoulder. He would call periodically. I would run into him, whatever. I ended up painting their house. I painted Judy's office. Because I was doing house painting at the time, after I got out of the restaurant business. And that pulled me back into their lives. And then I met my wife, Samantha, and we said, we're going to get married, you know, and I said, you know, I got the perfect person. And so Mal came out hesitantly, because he was always, just like preaching or going to see the board, he was always very nervous, and he needed to have a little bit of whiskey to do this with.
Maker's Mark.
Yes, and he put on his robes, and he performed a wonderful service, and obviously it worked real well. And it's so well that, you know, 10 years later or 15 years later, my oldest daughter wanted to be married, and we asked Mal if he would do it, and he did once again. So it's kind of, you know, I mean, Mal has been a huge influence on me. You know, I think there was a big political part at one point, and then there was kind of this, and then he came back into my life, but it wasn't me seeking him out, because I think everybody in this room will tell you, you know, they sought me out one way or another. Tim has done that, you know, Sally had done that, Dickie certainly, you know, beat on me quite often to, you know, hey, talk to me. But anyway, there we are.
Nice.
So does anybody have any summing up comments? Something that'll occur to you at midnight tonight? Damn, I wish I'd said that.
Can you call me at midnight?
I guess it's a question, and I don't know if Judy knows the answer. Do you think Mal knew how much influence he had on all of us?
A great question.
I don't know if people have answered, I mean,
I don't know.
I think Mal knew, I think he knew very well what he was doing, how he was doing it. Yeah, absolutely, I think he did, you know. Yeah, okay, there's my answer.
Yes, I think so. I said it before, he's a very sophisticated fellow, and a very, very sharp, not in a negative way, but a very sharp mind. Very sharp mind.
I keep with me his laugh,
Oh,
which was mentioned earlier,
wonderful.
and you know, it's hard to describe. He had a boisterous voice, and he had a boisterous, playful, wonderful laugh. And for me, what that laugh did was it reminded me that in all of this, you have to find the joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm glad that he became a potter.
Yeah.
Because I think that he carried so much that he needed that.
Yep.
And I think it's important for us to learn that lesson, that in all the madness, and there's so much madness going on today,
Yep.
on every level, that we do have to remember the joy. And I hear his laughter in my head, which I hope will stay with me.
Oh.
I agree with that. And I was thinking of the memorial service, because I'm running into people I hadn't seen in all these years. And I remember talking to several of us saying, you know, the issues that we were dealing with then, they're the same issues.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
They're still here.
Militarism, inequality,
Oh, sure.
poverty, racism, imperialism, whatever, you know, and it's kind of discouraging in a way. But yeah, you know, somebody was talking about the mimeograph machine. Does anyone remember the clipping that was stuck to the next word? It was a quote from Kim Il-sung saying, in case of attack, throw your body over the mimeograph. I said,
One thing that's different is you could never find a house for $225.
yes, that's true.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh,
I think
thank
we
you.
really
Thanks a
covered
lot.
a lot of
Thank you.
great ground. It's
Thank you.
really
A
wonderful.
pleasure.
And thanks to Beth also.
Yes,
Thank you
very
very
much.
Thank you.